Hey everybody, we're taking a look at chapter 16. We're going to do chapter 16 in two parts. In part 1, we're going to look at what's called a type 1 hypersensitivity, which generally is what you refer to as your allergies or an allergic type reaction. So let's take a look here at the beginning of chapter 16, part 1. And I start with just kind of making an analogy to the immune system in reference to kind of how a computer works. So the immune system is evolved and designed to protect the host from potential invading pathogens. And we've talked about this in the previous chapters. So you have an idea of kind of how that's designed to work. Now the problem is that it is in a lot of ways like a computer in that it's pre-programmed, so to speak, in a way to respond to any sort of incoming threat in kind of a predetermined way. And a computer works via a series of what are called if-then statements. I'm no computer expert, so I'm not going to pretend to be, but a computer will take any sort of incoming signal and process it in a kind of if-then statement. So if I hit the letter A on my keyboard, the computer is pre-programmed to input the symbol A by pixelating the screen at that exact spot, right? So if this, then that, right? So if I move my mouse, the computer's programmed to move the cursor in response, right? So that's all pretty obvious. The computer then, or the immune system then, is similar. And the problem with this sort of programming, pre-programming, is it lacks the ability to think, so to speak. So it can only really do what it's pre-programmed to do. And so if there's an incoming signal that the computer isn't properly designed to respond to, then we end up with error messages, and we end up with maybe a crash, or we end up with a glitch of some kind. So in some way the computer doesn't respond appropriately. We've all experienced this. We know firsthand what that's like. Well, the immune system is kind of similar. And so when it comes to allergies, for example, one of the things that's really happening here is that the immune system is responding to something that's a relatively non-threatening molecule like pollen, dust, dander, things like that really aren't a threat at all. They're not going to hurt you. But the immune system responds to it in a way where it thinks it's going to hurt you and ends up actually doing more harm than good by responding to something that it only perceives as a threat but actually isn't. So this is where the immune system lacks the ability to think. So the immune system is designed to respond to something foreign, something with a certain size and a certain characteristic like a protein. So something like a pollen molecule has the right shape and it has the right size and the right kind of characteristic to be seen as something foreign. And so the immune system will respond to it as a foreign threat, even though the reality is there's no actual harm that could be done by it. And when in responding to it in that way, it ends up causing all sorts of issues where we get a runny nose, we get a headache possibly, we get runny eyes, we cough, all that fun stuff, mucus production. And all of that is really just a really poor response, really inappropriate response to something that is only perceived as a threat that actually isn't. So it's kind of like the computer trying to respond to a signal that's not properly programmed to respond to, and you end up with an error or a glitch of some kind. So some of the most common things are like allergies and dermatitis, skin issues. These are typically fairly minor, more of just an annoyance and discomfort. Things like anaphylaxis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, autoimmune diseases, these can be life-threatening, fatal. They can certainly be debilitating. So the range of inappropriate response goes from minor discomfort to terminal, so from one extreme to the other. And obviously most things lie somewhere in between there. So that's kind of how to think about the immune system and really the disorders that come along with it. Like a computer, as long as everything is kind of following the coding, so to speak, it works fine. As soon as an input that comes in that's not properly programmed, it doesn't know how to handle it, and it responds in a very inappropriate way. And so by doing that in an inappropriate way, the immune system ends up doing more harm in a lot of cases than it actually does good. And that's just an unfortunate consequence of the way our immune system has evolved to respond. So the term immunopathology is a term that describes the different diseases or disorders associated with the immune system. So that's kind of the technical term for pathology means disease of the immune system. Now, really, there's two different ways that the immune system can respond in an inappropriate way. One is an overreaction, and these are what we generally refer to as a hypersensitivity, meaning you're overreacting. The other would be referred to as a hyposensitivity. Hypo meaning below the norm. So hyper means above the norm, hypo means below the norm, and that essentially means that you're underreacting. Now we're going to mostly focus here in the lecture part on the overreaction, the hypersensitivity reactions. Okay, so there are 4 types of hypersensitivities. And we refer to these in several different terms, so I'm going to give them to you in a couple different ways, and you want to be able to recognize them in each different way I'm giving them to you here. So for example, the four types of hypersensitivities can be kind of generally referred to as type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. Now, type 1 is a little bit more specifically referred to as a immediate hypersensitivity. Now, the other thing, I'll skip back and forth here. Type 1 involves the antibody. If you remember from chapter 15, antibodies are produced by B cells, and they have a response to antigen. What you also want to recognize is type 1 involves IgE and the release of histamine, which is one of the things that relates to allergies, which is why you take antihistamines for your allergies. So really, type 1 is the allergic reaction that I was referencing in the very beginning, and that's what we're going to focus on most heavily here in the first part of chapter 16, part 1. So recognize it as a type 1 immediate hypersensitivity involving IgE and histamine. Type 2 is referred to as antibody-mediated, also referred to as cytotoxic. And the reason it's called cytotoxic is because in this case we have antibodies that respond to cells in an inappropriate way. And the response with these cells causes cell lysis. It actually mentions that down here. Antibodies act upon cells with complement and cell lysis. Okay, so in this scenario, what's happening is we have an inappropriate response to a cell, and the result is the destruction of that cell. This is somewhat of a random example I pull off the web to give you a visual here, but a type 2 might look like this, where we've got an antigen that binds to a cell or ends up having a response with a cell, and the antibodies, which are designed to attack various things, end up attacking the cell, and as a result cause lysis of the cell, which is what you're seeing here, or complement destruction. So ultimately the antibodies will attack a cell and cause it to be destroyed. Now that's a good thing if it's a bad cell, and that's the way our immune system is evolved to respond to pathogens like bacteria. It's a bad thing if it is a non-harmful cell, or even a cell of your own body. That example there, this example here, is showing one of your own body's platelets, your blood clotting factors. So if your antibodies are attacking your platelets, that's a very bad thing, and that can lead to all sorts of blood disorders. So that's an example where you have a type 2 called cytotoxic because it's killing the cell. Now I want to add something here, and it does mention it here. I need to add this back to here, but type 2 involves IgG, and IgM, as it mentions here. So you want to recognize that this reaction involves 2 types of antibodies, IgG, IgM. Also recognize that it involves complement, which is where those complement proteins bind to a cell and cause the cell to lyse. Okay, and again, that's where the term cytotoxic comes in. Cytotoxic means cell death or cell destruction. A type 3, going back here, is sometimes referred to as an immune complex mediated reaction. Type 3 involves the same antibodies, IgG. Once again, it also involves IgM. So add that one as well, IgG and IgM. And what's happening here is it's actually very similar to a type 2 in that you have an antibody binding to an antigen and causing a reaction on the cell. The difference is a type 3 doesn't actually bind to a cell. I misspoke there. It involves the antibodies binding to an antigen, but not to a cell, but rather to free-floating antigen. So here's a quick visual on a type 3. What's happening here is we have an antigen that's free-floating. So in a type 2, the antigen is attached to a cell. In a type 3, the antigen is simply floating throughout the body somewhere. So it's not actually attached to anything. And like a leaf floating through the air as opposed to a leaf attached to a tree is like the difference. And what happens here with a type 3 is that really the same kind of antibodies, primarily IgG, but also IgM can play a role, will bind to the antigen. And what will happen is then other antibodies will bind to the same antigen, and you get what's called an immune complex. Now this is very similar to what we called an agglutination reaction back in chapter 15. So it's kind of like a form of agglutination, but not quite the same. So it's called an immune complex. So it looks like this. You get antibodies that are binding to an antigen, and then the other antibodies bind to the same antigen, and they all more or less clump together, and that's called an immune complex. Now that in itself isn't necessarily the problem. What happens next is that this whole complex will get lodged down into tissue of various types, as it's shown here. Here's the complex, this is tissue, and deposition means it's being deposited down in the tissue, and then that ends up ultimately triggering an inflammatory response that causes damage anywhere these deposits occur. Okay, so we'll come back to that when we get to the part 2. These by the way, type 2, type 3, and type 4, these will be discussed in part 2 of chapter 16. And then the last one, type 4, is called a delayed, also referred to as T-cell mediated, delayed, and it involves T cells and the release of cytokines, which are some of the chemicals produced by T cells and other white blood cells like macrophages. So you want to recognize type 4 is both considered delayed and also involves T cells. And the reason it's considered delayed is that usually a response like this takes somewhere around 24 to 48 hours before any sort of symptom or sign of a reaction takes place. And sometimes it can take even longer than that, but usually at least 24 to 48 hours. Whereas these other ones that get immediate can happen within a matter of seconds, may not be quite that fast, but usually minutes, seconds, maybe hours at the longest. So relatively quick. Whereas delayed is a relatively long, drawn-out process. Okay, so those are some of the overviews there of the type 4 types of hypersensitivities. Okay, so next we're just going to get into the type 1 type hypersensitivities, and again, these largely involve allergic reactions. So an allergy is really kind of any sort of exaggerated immune response that typically involves some level of inflammation. Inflammation in response to an allergic reaction usually involves runny nose, mucus production, lacrimation or tear production, runny eyes, cough, all these things. You've probably experienced these, so you're familiar with the general symptoms of an allergic reaction. The idea here is that anybody who's experiencing these allergies, these allergic symptoms, are hypersensitive to things called allergens. And really, an allergen is synonymous with an antigen. So I want you to think of an allergen as more or less the same thing as an antigen. The difference is an antigen is theoretically something that would be considered harmful, whereas an allergen would really, in most cases, be considered non-harmful. So the body, once again, going back to the analogy in a computer, the body thinks that the allergen is harmful, but in most cases it wouldn't be able to do any harm to you. But again, the response is more or less the same, and therefore the effect it ends up being similar. Now these are not identical, and there are lots of variances when it comes to these types of reactions. So something that you kind of already know from firsthand, not all allergies are the same, not all responses are equal, but that's the idea, is that the body is more or less mistaking the allergen for an antigen. And so we kind of use two different terms to relate to the context. And so in this case, an allergen is generally considered non-harmful, but you react to it anyway. So again, this is the nature of a type 1 hypersensitivity. Now, there are generally two types of type 1 reactions. One is called atopy, and this can also be referred to as an atopic reaction, depending on what context you're using that word. And these are generally considered local. So for example, if you have a seasonal allergy and you're have a runny nose or upper respiratory, generally speaking, that would be considered a type of atopic reaction. Another type is considered anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis can be systemic. There's actually two types of anaphylactic reactions, but largely these are usually considered systemic, in which you have a reaction that's taking place throughout the entire body. And these can be fatal. These can actually get pretty serious, in which you can have heart failure, respiratory failure, and the potential for these can become very, very serious pretty quickly. Whereas atopic usually are not a big deal, more of a discomfort as opposed to something very threatening or harmful. Now, when it comes to type 1, we refer to these as being an immediate reaction. But the truth is, you don't actually respond to the antigen or the allergen the very first time you're exposed to it. So the very first time you're exposed to any sort of potential allergen, you actually have what's called the sensitizing dose. The sensitizing dose is essentially kind of like a primer, so to speak. And what's happening is upon first exposure, your body is actually creating antibodies and memory cells to the allergen. So if you refer back to chapter 15 or just recall back, what happens upon first exposure is that you have macrophages that present the antigen to a T cell, which then activates a B cell. Then the B cells produce antibodies. Okay, the antibodies then become present in the body. And what happens later is if you're exposed again to that same antigen, then the antibodies are now present in the body to respond, right? When it comes to an allergy, you've got antibodies. Go back here just real quick. Got antibodies that are involved. In this case, the antibody IgE. So before the first time you're exposed to something, there is no antibody. Your body's never actually produced that antibody because it's never been exposed before. So therefore, the very first exposure is considered the sensitizing dose. What that basically means is that you, in that exposure, now producing antibodies that will later respond upon secondary exposure. So what's happening specifically is you're producing memory cells and antibodies towards that antigen. Now, sometimes people mistake this because in many cases, in some cases probably, it appears that the first exposure, you have a reaction. So in other words, it doesn't always seem true that the first exposure does not lead to a reaction. So theoretically, the first time you're exposed to something, you shouldn't have any reaction. Your body simply makes the memory cells and the antibodies, and then later, if you're exposed again, you'd have a reaction. But the truth is that the science would suggest, although it couldn't verify this in every case, but it would strongly suggest through experimental research that what is probably happening in these cases where it appears you have a reaction upon the first exposure is that what's actually happened is if you've been sensitized in very low doses prior without you being aware of it. So for example, take a penicillin reaction. A lot of people are allergic to penicillin, and usually they'll ask you if you have any prior allergies to penicillin before they give it to you, and people will often say no if they've never had penicillin or they're not aware of ever taking penicillin. And so it appears that the person's never had penicillin, never had an allergic reaction to it because they've never taken it, and upon the first dose they actually have an allergic reaction. So that would seem to contradict what we're saying here with the sensitizing dose. But what the scientists suggest is that most likely they've actually been exposed to small trace amounts of penicillin without them being aware of it. And one way that this in particular can happen is by trace amounts in your food. Animals are given lots and lots of antibiotics in their feed these days, and there have been many, many studies showing that trace amounts of lots of different antibiotics, including penicillin, can be found in meat that's purchased right over the counter. So a lot of studies I've seen, they go to the grocery store, and they just pull meat right off the shelf and they study it in the lab, and they find there's all sorts of different antibiotic residue in that meat. So that wouldn't necessarily be enough to cause antibiotic resistance. It also wouldn't necessarily be enough to cause an allergic reaction. So you wouldn't necessarily have a allergic reaction to the trace amounts of penicillin in your food. It typically takes a large dose for your body to actually have an allergic reaction. So that's why you wouldn't necessarily have any sort of any sign or symptom just by eating food like chicken meat, for example, with penicillin in it if you're allergic. But it would be enough to actually sensitize the body so that if you're exposed to a larger dose later, like if you've taken a penicillin shot or a prescription of penicillin, then you're exposed to a large enough dose that it will or could, if you're allergic to it, cause the reaction, the symptoms to take place. So the sensitizing dose can be very, very small, whereas the dose it requires for the reaction typically has to be relatively large. And that's why you could be allergic to penicillin, be sensitized by the food, but never have an allergic reaction to the food. Small dose will do the sensitizing, but it takes a large dose for the actual allergic reaction to take place. These can also take place via the placental transfer of antibodies, and that's another way that could happen. There's probably many other ways that could happen. So that was just an example with the penicillin there. Okay, so we said that type 1 is IgE, or involves IgE. Here it's stated as being IgE mediated. And IgE in particular is involved with this type of reaction due to the fact that IgE has evolved to interact very heavily with cells called mast cells and basophils. Now these were mentioned in the textbook reading of chapter 14. And mast cells and basophils are part of the second line of the immune system. And what they do is they release chemicals, things like histamine, that ultimately are responsible for the allergic symptoms that we experience during an allergy. So what's happening is the IgE is actually triggering these types of cells, mast cells and basophils, to release chemicals that cause the allergic symptoms to take place. Let me skip ahead just real quick, and I'll come back to those slides I passed there. This is actually what it looks like here. So the allergen comes into the body. This could be pollen, let's just say, tree pollen, plant pollen. Pollen comes into the body, and ultimately what's going to happen is it's going to trigger B cells that are going to release antibodies. Now there's several ways that the B cells can be activated, but ultimately what will happen is that B cells will be activated and they will release antibodies as they differentiate into plasma cells. So the B cells turn into plasma cells, they start to secrete antibody. Now in this case they're producing IgE in particular. IgE then becomes present in the body. Now what will happen next is IgE will bind to mast cells and or basophils. Go back here just real quick. There are two types of cells. These are actually very similar. Let me just give you the difference here. Actually, for a long time, scientists didn't know that there was a difference between these two. So they're almost identical. They're called something different, but they're near identical cells. And the difference is mast cells are stationary and basophils are mobile. Those are the general, kind of the primary difference that is between these two. So mast cells tend to stay positioned in one part of the body, whereas basophils can roam about the body through the circulatory system. So for the purposes of this lecture, they're more or less the same. Okay, so we're going to talk about them. We can kind of use the terms interchangeably. So when you create the antibodies, the IgE antibody, they will bind to these mast cells and basophils, and so they're evolved to interact hand in hand. Okay, so that's where the IgE becomes significant here, because that particular antibody will bind to the surface of these cells here. And now what they basically do is they act as a receptor for these mast cells and basophils. Okay, so the mast cells and basophils don't initially have them, so it's not quite like a traditional receptor that's automatically on the cell, but it becomes a kind of an ancillary receptor after they're produced by B cells. So this is an interesting way that the immune system works. So the immune cells the B cells rather produce the antibodies, and then they bind to the mast cell, and then they more or less act like a receptor. Now later, if you're exposed to that allergen again, what will happen is now the allergen will bind directly to these antibodies that are attached to the mast cells or the basophils. Now when that happens, the mast cells or basophils will do what's called degranulation, or they will release these chemicals from their cells. So these cells naturally have what are called granules, and these include things like histamine. Granules are just a fancy term for different chemicals that are produced by these cells. So the primary example here is histamine. Okay, and so histamine is released by these cells, shown here, enters into your bloodstream, and then those travel to different parts of the body and will cause a physiological response, i.e. an allergic symptom. So, for example, it'll cause your eyes to water, or it can cause hives to break out, or it can cause a runny nose, or a cough, or a headache, all sorts of different things. And then that is ultimately what's responsible for the symptom. So what's ironic about it is that the allergen really isn't directly what's responsible. It's only indirectly responsible. So it is only there to trigger the mast cell via the IgE interaction. And then it's the mast cell and the basophil that actually cause the symptom. So this again goes back to it being like a computer. This is not how it's supposed to work, really, because the allergen doesn't do you any harm. But simply by a defect in the immune system, it ends up triggering a response by these cells to have a reaction that causes a discomfort to us via the allergic symptom. So that's actually what's happening here, and that's why IgE is in particular involved, because it has the affinity to bind to these mast cells and basophils. Okay? I've got a video I'm going to show you here in just a second, but a couple more things here. Mast cells and basophils, like I said, then are also a big part of this, along with IgE. So there's some characteristics of these here, and this is one of the study guide questions. It was what are the 4 characteristics of the mast cells and basophils? So number 1, in combination, they're ubiquitous in tissue. So mast cells are stationary in the skin, for example, and basophils are traveling throughout the bloodstream. So with the 2 in combination, you'll find them pretty much anywhere in the body. Both have the capacity to bind IgE on the surface, and that's what we were showing there. So many IgE antibodies can bind anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 of different types. They don't have to all be the same antibody. So each one can bind large amounts, and so each cell can be covered, the surface can be covered with these antibodies. They contain secretory vesicles, which release cytokines, the example being histamine. These are also referred to as granules. So there's granules and cytokines, kind of the same thing, basically just chemicals that they release. And then they have a tendency to degranulate, meaning they release the contents. They release the cytokines, like histamine. So I don't know why they have to use different terms for the same thing. But granules, cytokines, the example being histamine, and degranulation just means the release of those primarily into the bloodstream, where they travel to the target organ. So those are some of the characteristics of those cells that make them respond the way they do to an allergen. And so this slide here is referencing the fact that once your cells are sensitized, they are primed with IgE. So in other words, you're exposed to the allergen, IgE binds to the surface of these cells. They can remain there for years potentially. And then the next time you're exposed to that allergen, you'll have an immediate reaction, theoretically, triggering the release of those cytokines into the bloodstream, like histamine. And the truth is, this gets very complicated in the sense that not everybody has equal response. First of all, not everybody has allergies that they're necessarily aware of. So allergies could possibly be happening, or an allergic reaction could be happening at a very low level to the point that you don't even realize it's happening. So that is possible. So you technically could be allergic to something without having a response that's obvious. But the truth is, some people really don't appear to have any allergic reactions at all. Other people have very serious allergic reactions. And so there's a lot of genetic factors that get into this. There's probably a lot of prior exposure throughout your lifetime the environment that you were raised as a child, the types of food that you were given as a child, probably a lot to do how you were breastfed or maybe lack thereof as a child. A lot of factors that can relate to how sensitive you are to different allergens. Also, how sensitive your mast cells are to IgE and how they respond to the presence of the allergen. Okay, so lots and lots of variation. So this is why some people could be exposed to tiny amounts of, say, cat dander and have a really bad reaction, whereas other people could be crawling in cats all day long and never have a reaction. It has to do with the sensitivity of their cells to the allergen. Okay, that doesn't really fully explain it, but that's something that really varies from person to person quite a bit. And that's why not everybody has allergies and why some people have high sensitivities versus low sensitivities. Here's a quick video showing the IgE response to an allergen.
Some people develop an allergic reaction or hypersensitivity when exposed to substances such as dust, pollens, animal dander, or penicillin. This hypersensitivity is mediated by IgE. Sensitization occurs when the antigen makes contact with some part of the body. The antigen is taken up, processed by antigen-presenting cells, and presented on a Class II MHC to T helper cells. Tissues under the mucous membranes are rich in B cells committed to IgE production, and IgE-producing cells are more abundant in persons susceptible to allergies. The T helper cells produce cytokines which stimulate these B cells to proliferate and differentiate into IgE-producing plasma cells. As IgE is produced in specific areas of the body, the IgE molecules attach via their constant regions to receptors on nearby mast cells. Mast cells contain granules packed with chemicals that induce a hypersensitivity response. Once attached, the IgE molecules can survive for many weeks. The individual is now sensitized to the antigen. When exposed to the antigen for a second time, the antigen binds to the IgE antibodies on the mast cells. To trigger a response, two cell-bound IgE molecules must react with a specific antigen. Within seconds of the reaction, the mast cell releases histamine and other mediators of the inflammatory response from the granules, triggering a variety of symptoms.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of the general way in which an allergic reaction takes place. Now, the next is some examples to go over different circumstances in which these can take place. So one of the most common types is referred to as a hay fever or allergic rhinitis, and more often actually this is referred to as just a seasonal allergy, generally speaking. So in this scenario, what's happening is you're breathing in airborne allergen, inhalant allergens, sometimes they're called, and you're getting a reaction often in the upper respiratory, sometimes lower respiratory, sometimes both, but generally it's an inhaled allergen that causes some sort of upper respiratory type reaction. And this is typically what leads to things like nasal congestion, sneezing, coughing, mucus, all that fun stuff, irritation of the eyes, and then again sometimes bronchoconstriction, which would be more of a lower respiratory issue where you have a hard time breathing, you can't catch your breath quite as well. So that's what probably a lot of us experience year to year. Seasonal allergies, technically referred to as allergic rhinitis, sometimes called hay fever. Asthma is a more severe form of allergic rhinitis that tends to manifest as a more exaggerated bronchoconstriction, tightening of the airways in the lungs. Oftentimes, asthma sufferers are highly responsive to the same kind of allergens and end up having a more severe type of response. You may have asthma, you may know someone that has it, and there are different severities. You may have mild asthma all the way up to severe asthma, and then obviously the difference would be the severity of the response. So asthma rates are going up, as the textbook indicates, over the last 25 to 30 years. No one seems to know exactly why. All sorts of really interesting theories on that. If you look at chapter 16 in the textbook, the very first part, the introduction, is talking about something that I've certainly heard about for a long time, something I usually mention in class, which is one of the theories on this is that being overly clean can actually work against you when it comes to things like allergies, hypersensitivities, and asthma. The theory is that, and this is, by the way, based on lots of studies that show people with asthma more commonly come from very clean environments as children. And so the theory based on some of this research is that if you're too clean early on in life, you're not exposed to enough dirt and grime, so to speak, then the body isn't properly sensitized. And without being able to explain all the details, and I'm not sure that anybody really could, I certainly can't, but in general, the idea is that you need to be exposed to a certain number of antigens early on to kind of prime your body to the right level, so to speak. And if you're not being exposed early enough at a high enough rate, the body's not being properly conditioned. And then later in life, your body will over-respond to some of the same allergens and antigens that would otherwise be suppressed. And this is probably one of the general things that explains the difference between one individual and another in terms of how they're responding. So you and I could be in the same room, be exposed to the same allergens, and one of us has a severe response and the other may have no response or a mild response. And that difference could possibly be explained, or potentially explained, at least in part, by the difference between our exposures at a young age. So if I come from a really clean environment and you had more exposure to dirt and grime, then that difference could explain how our immune systems react in accordance. So if you have children, you might do some more research on this, and what a lot of experts are saying is not necessarily let them get overly exposed, but don't shelter them away too much. Being too clean may actually work against you. Our body's evolved to handle all sorts of nasty, dirty stuff, and taking ourselves entirely out of that environment turns out to probably be a bad thing. So that's an example. Another example, allergic rhinitis, asthma. A third example is called atopic dermatitis, sometimes referred to as eczema in this example. Eczema is a scenario where the allergy manifests in the skin. So it's kind of like allergic rhinitis. The difference is that the symptoms occur in the skin as opposed to in the upper or lower respiratory tract. In this scenario, you end up with dry, scaly, thickened skin. Often occurs in the face, the scalp, the neck, or sometimes on the limbs of your body, and sometimes the trunk of the body. And they say that this typically begins in infancy and progresses throughout adulthood. And this is much less common, so this is probably not something you've experienced. Maybe you have, but much less common, and tends to begin early in life and progresses throughout. So in other words, from my understanding, you don't typically develop this later in life. There probably are exceptions to that, but kind of as a general rule, you tend to have it throughout your life or you don't. And so it's not something like an allergy to, like an upper respiratory allergy that could just develop later in life. That's very possible there. Some people just develop those later in life, whereas this you probably wouldn't develop later in life. Next are food allergies. Food allergies are, again, similar. The difference is it's something you ingest, obviously. And these can tend to be more serious because you're internalizing the allergen into your digestive tract, which then can theoretically be passed into the circulatory system, which can then theoretically spread throughout your entire body. So with a food allergy, you have a greater potential for more of a systemic reaction due to the fact that you're internalizing and disseminating that antigen or allergen throughout your body internally. So any reaction that you have will be kind of more widespread, so to speak, throughout the body, whereas say a pollen inhaled allergen typically remains confined to one area, like the upper respiratory tract. Now it also depends on how sensitive. Some, once again, food allergies, like all other allergies, you can have a very strong reaction or a mild reaction, very weak reaction. So obviously then the symptoms would be in response to your sensitivity. But again, generally speaking, they're more pronounced just for the fact that you're kind of spreading them throughout your body. They tend to result in a respiratory reaction, skin reactions, and then of course gastrointestinal, because obviously we're putting it into our stomach. But once again, this is kind of a similar reaction involving IgE and mast cells, just more from an internal standpoint. And remember, these are ubiquitous in the tissue, therefore you'll find these in your intestinal tract like you would anywhere else. Some of the symptoms here: vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, could result in the rash on the skin, hives, rhinitis, asthma. Severe allergic reactions can result in anaphylaxis. I'm not sure why this is, but there are very common foods that will result in food allergies. So peanuts are kind of a classic example, fish, milk, specifically cow's milk, eggs, shellfish, soybeans, other ones like wheat, things like that can cause allergies more commonly than other types of food. But really almost any food could theoretically. Gluten is another one that a lot of people are talking about. Gluten sensitivity has become a big hot button topic. So gluten's another type of wheat. That would really kind of be like a wheat allergy from gluten. So I wanted to show you something I've been hearing about lately. Now this is something you want to take with a grain of salt, so don't just go out and immediately implement this advice here. But one of the things that they're now suggesting is that kids should be given peanuts prior to the age of 6 months, and they're showing that this will dramatically reduce their chances of actually developing a peanut allergy. So some of the advice that you might hear from a doctor is to avoid peanuts for kids at an early age, and the fear is that if they have a reaction, it can be much more harmful at a young age. So some of the previous advice have basically been avoid peanuts early on in life. Now some of those same doctors and experts, are based on new research, are actually saying the opposite. Give some peanut butter to your babies, not much, just a little bit, but at a young age prior to 6 months, and that reduces the chance of a peanut allergy by as much as 80%, according to some of these studies. So take that advice with a little bit of caution, and maybe look into that, ask your doctor, talk about it, look it up online. But anyway, some of the kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about being too clean. Avoiding things like peanuts may actually be contributing to a rise in peanut allergy. How ironic, right? So you want to do some more research if that relates to you. If you have a peanut allergy in your family, before giving it to your kids, you might want to do a little more research on that. But that's what they're saying. Basically, don't be so quick to avoid. It may be better to take it head on and prime the body, and that apparently is pretty significant in reducing the rates of peanut allergies in particular later on in life. Next is a drug allergy. Drug allergies are very similar to food allergies. You're internalizing something that the body perceives as an antigen, and therefore you end up reacting to it kind of on a systemic level. So a lot like a food allergy, you end up with anything from an atopic to a very, very systemic anaphylaxis, or potentially fatal anaphylaxis. Drug allergies are interesting in that they often react with some of the body tissue, and then the body reacts to the combination of the drug and the tissue itself. And this is what's referred to as a hapten. Let me show you an image here. This is what a hapten would look like. So the hapten is really the antigen, so to speak. But in this example, the antigen is so small that it's not big enough to bind to an antibody. If you recall from chapter 15, there's a certain minimal size that an antigen has to be before it's actually able to trigger a reaction by an antibody. So haptens are by themselves too small, but what they end up doing is they bind to a carrier molecule, oftentimes one of the body's own tissue components, and then that in combination with the hapten will trigger a response. So it's interesting how that works. So that the hapten has to bind to a carrier, and then that becomes, in combination, able to act as an antigen. So that's often what's happening with a drug allergy. Antibiotics such as penicillin are some of the most common drug or allergy-inducing drugs. Now, penicillin has been always stated as the most common drug allergy, and that's a question on the study guide. It is possible that's changed or is changing. I'm not honestly seeing some of the latest research there. If someone finds information that contradicts that, let me know, because that very well may be the case. Penicillin, as well as other drugs like cephalosporins, these are both types of antibiotics. These are generally some of the highest rates of drug allergy, and that's because these types of drugs like penicillin and cephalosporins, they actually are derived from fungus. The penicillin especially is a drug that comes from a fungi that produces the penicillin itself. So you're actually deriving the penicillin from a fungus, a mold fungus specifically. So that's actually where penicillin comes from. It comes from a fungus. So it actually would make sense that that's one of the most common drug allergies, because it's basically a fungal compound that just so happens to be toxic to bacteria, and that's why we use it as a drug. So your body, when it responds to penicillin, is actually responding to what it perceives as a fungal compound, which is exactly what it is. So that's why some of those drugs are the more common allergy-inducing medications. But again, penicillin may not be the number one drug allergy anymore. My guess is, if that is the case, it's simply just because of the lower use of penicillin. At one point, penicillin was one of the most commonly prescribed drugs in the world, and that's now coming down because of the fact that the drug resistance is just not as effective as it used to be. So fewer doctors are using it for that reason. So my guess is that it may not be the number one drug allergen simply because of the usage going down. But just to clarify on the study guide, that's the answer I'm looking for. So anaphylaxis is really a very, very strong reaction to an allergen. So there's really two types. The most common is called a systemic anaphylaxis, and this is where you have a kind of a widespread, strong allergic reaction. So a systemic anaphylaxis. This can result in very, very severe consequences: respiratory distress, heart failure, what you refer to often as a code blue, for example. Code blue could come from a variety of things, but an anaphylactic response would definitely result in what you would call a code blue. Bee stings, antibiotic injections, drug allergens, things like that can all cause these. But also, food allergies, things like that. Peanut allergies, for example, can be very, very serious if you have a strong peanut allergy, because that can result in systemic anaphylaxis. Now, another type is actually less severe, called a cutaneous anaphylaxis, also referred to as a wheal and flare reaction. This can happen where you have a strong reaction but in a local area. So it's kind of like an atopic reaction, but it's differentiated by the severity of that local reaction. So this is actually what it looks like here. Wheal and flare is really kind of like a welt, basically, and what you have is kind of a swelling in a local area of the skin. Now, this is what happens if you do skin allergy testing, is what that's showing here. They mark different parts of your skin, and then they inject different substances, and they look to see what kind of reaction you have to different substances. So that's how they do allergy testing from a dermatologist. So the wheal is referred to as the kind of the fluid-filled area, the swollen area, and then the flare is the red area that occurs around that. What's happening beneath the surface is you've got vasodilation as the antigen causes a reaction by some of the mast cells there. They release chemicals that cause the blood vessels to dilate. That releases fluid that causes the swelling, and then an increase in some of the red blood cells is what causes the redness beneath the surface there. And then inflammatory chemicals like cytokines cause the itchiness that often accompanies that. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 16, part 1. In part 2, we'll go on and take a look at the type 2, the type 3, and the type 4 hypersensitivities.